Okay, now we're recording. Okay, so we are going to be talking about some articles. Um, I'm going to share my screen. All right. So basically, this is the layout. My article was about basically. I'm trying to find the title. Hold on 1 second. Oh my gosh, I'm like an actor. I'm like, wait, I have to start over. Okay, so basically our article, what I got out of it was that it basically is talking about how child sexual abuse, and intimate partner violence like affects like women, right? Where in the article it says like they don't feel normal. So what I put is some of the main points is self-blame, right? Was a big thing that I talked about the article. It's related to higher reports of non-disclosure to others and re-victimization. So basically what the article was about, which was it was like a research study finding out how each of those things that happen, whether it's sexual abuse, interpartner violence, and child sexual abuse, if that like affected the individual. So self-blame was a big thing, and like if they blame themselves for what happened to them, they had a higher increase to not disclose, right? And also to be re-victimized. So having the possibility of happening again. Another main point of this article was that there's two different categories in self-blame. So behavioral self-blame and caterological. And then separate from that is general self-blame. But basically, there's two different ones. Behavioral is like it's like a learned type of self-blame, and like character self-blame is like you feeling that like something's wrong with you, and because something's wrong with you, unfortunately, you experience sexual abuse and intimate partner violence and all that. Those who experience sexual abuse and IPV, intimate partner violence, with previous child sexual abuse had higher outcomes of PTSD and self-esteem and maladaptive coping like binge drinking and suicidal ideation. Disclosure to law enforcement and formal support, so like case managers, therapists, etc., increased re-victimization for women who experienced these types of, I guess, violence towards them and abuse. So that's what I found interesting, that victim blaming, right? And that's basically like the blaming the victim for what happened to them. It's more prevalent in Asian and Hispanic cultures. So I don't know if that's like a cultural background or something, but there's a lot more stigma towards it. So amongst those two kinds of cultures, women felt more like they were blamed for what happened to them. Victims also felt re-victimized when support from formal like therapists or help-seeking behaviors, or informal from like family, friends, partners, would want to repair the victim or undo their wrongs. So basically, like when they would disclose that they've experienced abuse to somebody, they felt re-victimized because the people that they disclosed to were basically the ones like, I guess, wanting to like repair the damage that has been done. So their helpful, like wanting to repair that, actually helps people feel re-victimized. For sexual intimate partner violence, victims felt more self-blame than in other forms of intimate partner violence. So like domestic violence, that wasn't like women's fault, like they didn't feel like that was their fault, but when they were like sexually abused by a partner, then that's when they self-blamed themselves. And then it's more severe in women who experienced internalized stigma. So basically, if they have these beliefs and like value systems that, you know, that they deserve to be abused, the blame was more significant in them. And then the questions I would have asked to the class is, do you think formal supports like law enforcement lack understanding of trauma-informed care? Because something that they said in the article was that, when they disclosed to law enforcement, they always got the impression that like they didn't believe them, or like the cops thought it was like their fault that they got abused. So yeah, I was gonna say, like, do you think that they lack understanding just in general, like of what trauma-informed care is? My other question would have been, how can we help women with reducing internalized stigma? I think, like, as a female, it's hard to not internalize certain stigmas that we grow up with. So I think as social workers, like, we need to find ways how we can help women reduce stigma. My other question was, how can we help reduce victim blaming for survivors? Because a trait that they all present is that they blame themselves a lot for everything that happened to them. So maybe posing some like interventions or techniques. And then one thing that was like different, and like I put the link here, because there was a lot of repetitive words in the article. I just wanted to like find out more about how intimate partner violence affects survivors economically. So that's a link to the article, and I can send it on Canvas. But basically, it's saying that women who are abused, it's more expensive to the states because they're more hospitalized, they have more health issues, um, lack of wanting to go to school or find other alternatives in being successful financially. So that was pretty interesting, and wasn't really related to the article, but there was a section that was a form of intimate partner violence. So I went like a little beyond the article, tried to relate it so I can understand it a little bit more, and thought about that. So that was my interpretation of the article.
You mentioned earlier about how the culture about intimate partner violence for men, that's what it relates to. Is that what I heard, or was I not, or am I mistaken? And the only reason I bring that up is because in the article that I read, it's called Latino Fathers, the Relationship Among Machismo, Acculturation, Ethnic Identity, and Paternal Involvement. A lot of culture was brought up, and a lot of the lack of education and lack of resources that they were able to access because of the language barrier came up. So I can definitely see how a lot of them tend to demonstrate aggressive behavior, because the article also discussed machismo. So it did say that a lot of the men that demonstrate machismo do this because they get frustrated and they can't express their feelings, they can't express what their thoughts and how they feel about a certain situation. And that machismo actually leads them to have a lack of connection with their child, because men that show machismo also demonstrate unhealthy relationship with their children.
Okay, I think like we can have Ale like explain more because she also read the article,
Mm-hmm.
and then I guess we can relate that after.
For me, one of the things that I kind of wanted to focus on is where I talked a lot about trauma informed care, like what can we do in general, like hospitals, and just other social workers and just doctors, nurses, to educate them more about like um, how to help. Like, it doesn't really talk about it here in the article, but how to first respond to someone who's like coming out of a really traumatic event. Um, I know like emergency rooms are usually like very like fast and very like just we need to get this done. Um, so one of the things that I was wondering about is like what can we do in terms of like policy or just in general to educate healthcare workers, not just law enforcement, but healthcare workers to respond to someone who's um, recovering from a traumatic experience. Um, and just like she said, like um, in general, like educating one another about trauma informed care, and then just doing things to kind of reduce the stigma and reduce like victim shaming, um, victim blaming.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's what I got out of the article too, right? Like, I think that like as women, like these experiences that they have, like we know that it happens, right? And we might have certain feelings towards it, but we're not really doing much to like change that. So I think that's what I got out of the article at the end of the day. Like I wish I would have went more into detail about certain things because I got interested into the article based on the title, like oh I don't feel normal. So I was expecting them to say why, like why are those reactions, and then it was just more about research that other people had put. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what the writers were trying to do was just try to report the evidence that they found, but it kind of lacked clarity as far as like their purpose of writing this whole paper. So yeah, just trying to find out like what we can do. So I think that's a question that maybe we can ask ourselves, but it wasn't necessarily something that's in the paper.
What was your question, Soledad?
Just about the culture, how domestic violence, men that demonstrate, like, that aggression. And it wasn't more of a question, it was more of a how it was. I know it was somebody mentioned it had to do with culture. And that's also what the article that I read talked about a lot, culture, when they carry that culture with them from like immigrant Latino fathers, when they carry their culture with them to another place, like to the United States, it makes them difficult for them to assimilate to the culture of the United States. So I can definitely see how being in a really being a man being abusive to his wife, they're carrying that culture. Also, like a father continuing to not be engaged in their child's life. It's also something that they carried a culture. That's what they've seen or grown up seeing, that it makes it difficult for them to assimilate to what the law is once they enter a different uh, country, a different culture in their life. That's how I can see it, the article dissimulating. Because, and I only bring that up because he wants to kind of see how we're having a conversation about how each article is kind of similar in its own sense. So that's where I picked up culture. That's how it's similar to the article that I was reading.
Okay. Okay. So what other main points was from the article that you read, Soledad?
That's in relation with the art with your guys's article. Basically, just culture, because my article was more of how a Latino father, how his paternal involvement varies in regards to the gender and how they acculturate and their ethnic identity. So it was more of a positive thing of how there's three frameworks. It discussed how there's three frameworks of paternal involvement. So the three frameworks that it talked about was engage, accessibility, and responsibility. So when a father is engaging with their child, it's more about the amount of time that they're spending with their child. And that involves playing, doing homework, and how that interaction helps the child develop a healthy environment, how it helps the child succeed in school. So it talks about, that's the part where when a father acculturates to the United States, this is the outcome, rather than when a father doesn't, continues carrying their culture and continues carry their belief, they do significant damage in the relationship and bond they create with their child.
So parents that fathers that were not like acculturated to this culture, they were not like basically bonding as much with children or helping them as much.
Yeah, they weren't bonding with their children, they weren't helping them, so they were basically, they were in the home, but because they lacked acculturation, they were considered to carry that machismo, um,
Mm-hmm.
attitude, and they were considered more of the breadwinners, and that's how they felt they were contributing to their child. That's how they felt, like, well, I'm working and I'm the breadwinner, so this is what I'm doing to have
This is
a
how I contribute to my
right,
father.
right.
Do you like see there be any relationship between like the father just seeing himself as a breadwinner, not necessarily emotional support? Um,
It
like
did talk about that a little bit, because it was more of like the research was more focused on how they acculturate more so than how they there was a brief part where it says that fathers that are considered to be a breadwinner, they feel isolated, because sometimes when they do want to attend parent conference meeting, the teacher or like the doctor will mainly talk to the mom, so they already feel like, okay, well, I'm already seen as a breadwinner, so why am I engaging? Does that make sense?
yeah, I'm just wondering like how would that like come into play to like because we when we talk about childhood abuse, we talk a lot more. It's not just about physical or sexual, it's about the neglect. So I'm just wondering about like the emotional neglect that the kid had, if the father feels more like of a breadwinner than
Yeah,
thinking.
there could definitely be an emotional neglect in that, and that could also be carried on from the way that they grew up. So if that's the idea they saw for their father, then that's what they were taught. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Even
yeah,
though,
yeah, yeah.
and it could
Like
change.
passed on, right? Like
Yeah, exactly. And it could change, because even if like it is a situation where, let's say, the father were, because that's what the article is also talking about, like, let's say the situation that there's a father that came to the United States, and is an immigrant and had children here, and that father's son grows up and says, oh, I don't want to be like that, so that child is born and raised in the United States, so their culture is the United States, so they view things different, and they decide to do things different. So that's how the article was kind of like relating how it impacts a child.